The afternoon light slipped through the kitchen window like liquid gold, painting the room in a soft, forgiving glow. Laura moved in her quiet rhythm, the one she'd perfected over years. The careful choreography of someone who held a family together without ever asking for applause. Every motion had meaning, every silence a purpose. The cloth in her hand swept across the counter, steady and practiced, yet her shoulders carried the quiet tremor of exhaustion she never spoke about. At 42, Laura had learned the art of composure, but the faint shadows beneath her eyes told the truth her voice never did. That even strength can grow weary when it never rests. Mark had been gone most days before dawn and returned long after dusk. The kind of husband who built things with his hands but didn't always know how to fix what time eroded between them. His construction projects had swallowed his days whole, leaving behind sawdust, deadlines, and the quiet distance that grows unnoticed until it becomes familiar. Their children, Ethan and Lily, filled the house with the kind of chaos that both drained and kept her alive. Half-finished homework, sports practice, music from behind closed doors. Through it all, Laura was the constant hum beneath their noise, the one who made everything seem effortless, even when nothing was. That Saturday felt like any other, predictable, unremarkable, but that's how most turning points begin. The morning arrived with the scent of coffee and the ache of repetition. She'd driven Lily to her soccer game, answered a concerned teacher's call about Ethan's missing assignment, and navigated the grocery aisles on autopilot. By the time she returned home, her body ached. Not from work, but from the kind of invisible weight that builds when a life depends on you never slowing down. Mark entered from the backyard, brushing sawdust from his arms, his shirt clinging with the scent of cedar and sunlight. He paused when he saw her, just long enough for her to realize he was really seeing her. "You're sore again," he said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. There was worry in his voice, but also something else. Guilt, maybe, or tenderness rediscovered. Laura tried to smile. "Just tired," she said. "It's been a long week." He didn't argue. Instead, he crossed the kitchen and placed his rough hands gently on her shoulders. "Come on, sit, let me help." It startled her, not his touch, but the invitation to rest. She hesitated, then gave in, lowering herself into the chair. The world didn't fall apart when she stopped moving. It just breathed with her. Mark's hands were firm but careful, tracing years of tension stored in her muscles like unspoken stories. The warmth of his palms grounded her, unwinding something she didn't realize had been holding her together and tearing her apart at the same time. Her breath slowed, her eyes fluttered closed. For the first time in months, her body remembered what safety felt like. "You're good at this," she murmured. Mark chuckled softly, his voice a low warmth against the quiet. "Guess all that time working with wood finally paid off." Laura smiled, not the polite smile she'd mastered, but the fragile one that came from somewhere real. It wasn't just the relief of touch. It was being noticed. In that small, ordinary moment, he'd reminded her that she still existed beyond the endless giving. When she finally turned to face him, something subtle passed between them. An unspoken truce. The distance between who they'd become and who they once were seemed to shrink in the space of a single heartbeat. "You might have just saved my day," she whispered. Mark brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, his thumb lingering for just a second longer than habit allowed. "Good," he said. "You deserve it." That evening, the air in the house felt lighter, like someone had opened a window that had been shut for too long. Ethan walked into the living room and stopped mid-step. His parents were sitting together on the couch, laughing. Not the polite laughter that filled dinners or phone calls, but the kind that came from deep inside the chest. The kind that echoed memory. Laura leaned her head against Mark's shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan saw them as more than parents. As people who still knew how to find each other after all the noise. Moments later, Lily patted in, a bowl of popcorn in hand. She paused at the sight of them, her grin teasing. "You two are acting weird," she said. Laura laughed, the sound warm and effortless. And though no one said it aloud, they all felt it. The fragile peace that comes when a family remembers not just how to live together, but how to see each other again. They didn't talk about it much after that night. The laughter, the quiet closeness, the way the world had briefly felt lighter. But the house began to change in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Dinner lasted longer. The silence that used to hang heavy between them was replaced by something gentler, a quiet ease. There was warmth now in the pauses, in the small exchanges that once went unnoticed. It was as if they were both trying to remember, slowly, carefully, what it felt like to take care of each other. Weeks passed, and life resumed its steady rhythm. School drop-offs, grocery runs, work deadlines, the everyday chaos marched on, but beneath it all, there was a softness that hadn't existed before. Mark started waking early just to make her coffee. 2 sugars, a dash of cinnamon, the way she liked it when they first met. Laura began leaving small handwritten notes tucked inside his lunchbox. Little reminders that said things like, "You're doing great," "Don't skip lunch," or simply "Love you." They weren't grand gestures, just fragments of tenderness stitched into ordinary days. Sometimes, in the early mornings before the world stirred, they'd stand together on the porch, watching the sky blush with sunrise. Other nights, when the kids were asleep and the house finally quiet, they'd sit on the couch, their shoulders brushing, neither speaking, but both knowing. It was a fragile kind of peace, the kind that comes not from perfection, but from effort. Then, one late afternoon, everything shifted. Mark's truck didn't pull into the driveway at its usual time. At first, Laura barely noticed, just glanced at the clock, assuming he'd stayed late to finish something. But as twilight bled into darkness and his phone went unanswered, a slow unease began to settle in her chest. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, that delays happened, that he'd walk through the door any minute with his usual tired smile. But when the phone finally rang, everything inside her stilled. The voice on the other end was calm, but distant. The kind of tone that people use when they're trained to deliver bad news gently. There had been an accident at the site. Machinery failure, injuries. No clear details yet. The rest unfolded in fragments. The drive to the hospital she barely remembered. The sound of her own breath echoing inside the car. The sterile hallways, white and humming, where every second stretched unbearably long. Time dissolved there. Days blurred into one another. Endless beeps, whispered updates, waiting rooms that smelled of antiseptic and fear. But even in that uncertainty, Laura held on to something. That quiet afternoon in the kitchen, his hands on her shoulders, his voice low and steady. That moment when he'd reminded her that love wasn't about grand declarations, but about showing up quietly again and again. When Mark finally opened his eyes, pale but smiling faintly, Laura's composure broke. The tears came without warning, not of fear, but of release. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as she whispered, "See? It's my turn to take care of you now." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a fragile breath, the corners of his mouth curving into something that was both gratitude and apology. The days that followed were slower, measured. Healing was not a straight line. Some mornings were filled with hope, others with exhaustion. But through it all, Laura stayed. The same hands that had once carried every invisible burden now carried him through recovery. Steady, patient, unwavering. She realized, somewhere along that quiet journey, that love had not only survived, it had transformed. The moment that once loosened her tired shoulders had also strengthened her heart. Months later, when Mark could finally walk unaided again, they stood in the kitchen once more, sunlight spilling across the same counter where it all began. He reached out, brushing his thumb across her hand. No words were needed. The silence between them was full of everything they'd lost and everything they'd learned to hold on to. From that day forward, neither of them took the small moments for granted. The shared coffee, the sound of laughter, the feel of a hand finding yours at the end of a long day. Because they'd learned something that only loss can teach. That the quiet, ordinary acts of love are never ordinary at all.